Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Sara. Sara, how are you?
Good, thanks, Nick.
I'm very good, thank you. And Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
I'm good today. A bit chilly, but otherwise good.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. Thursday and Friday looks like it's going to be another one of those nice, chilly days. But I must say, we were cautioned by a listener not to engage in so much self-congratulatory backslapping at the start of every episode. But I worry that if we remove the self-aggrandizing, self-praising backslapping, there really won't be much left of this podcast. So anyway, I hope you will continue to indulge us. And let us get into the news of today. So our first story for today is what I jokingly, or maybe somewhat jokingly, call the greatest idea that the ANC Youth League has had since the 1930s, or maybe even the 1920s. And that is, of course, the ANC Youth League and the Progressive Youth Alliance, which is, I think, the ANC Youth League, the Young Communist Association, and the South African Congress of Students, have called on businesses, individuals, and leaders to donate Sjamboks to young people to, quote, help us defend our schools. ANC Youth League Johannesburg Regional Task Team member Penyo Maduna said the Progressive Youth Alliance was making a special call directly to young people who should be, quote, the vanguards of our societies to Sjambok anyone who intends to damage our school infrastructure. As the Progressive Youth Alliance will be in the process of distributing Sjamboks to young people. We as the Progressive Youth Alliance in Greater Palestine Central have recently noticed intended actions and threats by some rascals to vandalize and or burn schools. This has been seen in KwaZulu-Natal as there were reports that more than 50 schools have been damaged. We condemn this action with the contempt it deserves and call on everyone who wishes to express their dissatisfaction with government, judiciary, or any institution to do so without damaging infrastructure that is meant to free us from the chains of the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and equality. They then go on to say that they are launching their 100 Sjamboks per ward, one young person, one Sjambok campaign. This has been condemned by the Department of Education, which said that they are aware of a media statement calling for the use of violence as a way of protecting schools from vandalism. And while they agree on the need to protect schools from vandalism, we must also urge that people keep it within the limits of the law. So before I get into this, I forgot to say at the beginning of the show, I do have a nosebleed. And since we do these shows live now, if I suddenly start gushing blood from my nose or turn off my camera or something, that's probably the reason why. Anyway, Terence, should we be arming the youth with Sjamboks to defend schools?
I don't quite know where to begin with this one. I think the polite answer, Nicholas, is no, we shouldn't. It's not a great idea to be randomly handing out Sjamboks. Now,
But Terence, aren't we being hypocritical? We've been talking the whole last week about how people should be defending their communities and private property.
Yeah, I think it's really the ANC Youth League calling for it. A bastion of reflection and mature politics, wanting to hand out Sjamboks. That sort of gets to me. I remember because I am that old, reading the New Nation, which was sort of ANC and drag back in the 1990s, and someone said something about the Sjambok being a symbol of state repression, and I think got a point. Now the idea is you want to sort of hand them out complete with a ready-made slogan, like one student, one Sjambok. Something tells me that this is not going to be, contained within the community of the righteous, seeking to protect public property. But and I think unfortunately children should not be used as foot soldiers. No, I agree. I don't even think you have foot soldiers here. I think you'll just have lots of people with Sjamboks. No, I think it demonstrates the level of political maturity we have in parts of our politics. And I'm also just wondering, they talk about the Greater Palestine area, so are they going to be patrolling the West Bank as well? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I mean,
sometimes you can't make this stuff up in South Africa.
No, I agree. There's something interesting about this, though, which to me suggests that I wouldn't say that this is very much in keeping with ANC ideology in some ways, right? The idea that, so yes, it's been dressed up in a lot of revolutionary language here, that young people are the vanguard of society, etc., etc. But there is something about there being a very conservative law and order tint to all of this, which I think reflects more what South Africans actually believe than what the ANC believes. And it's just interesting to see it in influencing even the ANC Youth League, which I'm not even sure how much it exists anymore. Obviously, there's someone who's still able to put out media statements, but that doesn't mean that there is an organization. Sara, what do you make of this?
Yes, I think you've talked about the right thing in referring to the conservatism. I think South Africans generally are conservative. I'm not sure that the ban on corporal punishment in schools is as widely supported by parents as it is by staff, or as it may be more particularly by our political masters. Because, I mean, obviously corporal punishment was used extensively, probably way too extensively. But in a society where often it's very difficult to keep control as a parent or a community, the drastic measures are used, and this would include shamboking, which is as old as the hills. I think there are probably a few teachers who would dearly love to have some of their charges shambok, but that nevertheless, I agree with you on who's doing the shamboking, and that is the Long in the Tooth Youth League. I wouldn't put it past them to decide that, well, the advantage of Sjamboks is it gives you an opportunity to get aggressive and violent without actually firing a gun and by standing 1.5 meters away from somebody. So I don't think great heroism is at the heart of all of this. But so the answer is no, of course we shouldn't give them Sjamboks, but you have to give them 10 out of 10 for trying.
Yeah, I must say that with the very, very low expectations that the ANC, I think, set for us in terms of policy responses, protecting property is a good sentiment to come out of the ANC. I wish we'd see a lot more of it. I wish we'd see it a lot more responsibly expressed, rather than saying that every young person should have a shambok.
One person, one shambok. Okay? One student, one
but
shambok.
It is, yeah, exactly. It is nice to hear a little bit of a change, rather than saying things like, we must burn the schools to demand better education, or we must shut the schools. Yeah, we must shut the schools until they are free, or all these other things that constantly come out of the sort of South African left-wing youth milieu.
I'd just like to jump in on the question of conservatism, and who embodies or who believes in that. I think the ANC is an interesting is in an interesting situation. The late Lawrence Schlemmer discussed something I think which is broadly applicable here. That within the ANC itself, you have an almost Victorian sense of values, or not lived out or whatever, but the idea that this vanguard is responsible for the people as opposed to the people. Actually, that's Scammon killing me, not Schlemmer. But what Schlemmer pointed is that there's this kind of service fringe that has existed around the ANC, which he referred to as politically correct. This is where you find the commitment and the taking up of current social causes and fads and whatever. But I don't think that actually goes very deep into the psyche of some of its more senior people. And I think that much of what we would associate, let's say, with the authoritarian right, actually finds a certain level of sympathy. It's expressed differently, and perhaps authoritarian right and authoritarian left have a lot more in common than they're willing to let on. You consider something like Castro's Cuba was almost puritanical in the way it regarded things like homosexuality. And I suspect that a lot of this has endured. As far as the question of corporal punishment in schools goes, I wonder whether that is not more extensive now than we actually realize. And I know that when caning was abolished, there were occasional reports in the press, or I think Dennis Beckett had something to say about this, speaking to school principals who would say, well, yes, this is what the law says, but in our culture, we must discipline our children. So I suspect a fair amount of that is probably going on. But here we have the juniors, although you can be in the ANC Youth League and be well into your 30s, who might well decide to use those Sjamboks on their teachers.
Yes. I think there is a constituency though for this kind of rhetoric, and that's very much because there's so many South Africans who, as we've said and as we saw over the last week, are so oppressed by lawlessness that they jump at anything that seems like a harsh measure to deal with crime or lawlessness or disorder. So it's the same people who support the death penalty very aggressively. It's the same people who want corporal punishment reintroduced in schools. The ANC Youth League here, I don't know if the idea of young people running around with Sjamboks will appeal to all of that community, but I think there's some who will certainly look at this and be like, no, this is at least moving in the right direction, if it's not the best version of the idea. Any final thoughts, Sara?
Just to say that the head of my kid's primary school, when this came in, it was less draconian than it is now. What he would do is he always held, and I think he's probably right, that there's some kids that the only way you get through them is with the hiding. So what he'd do is he had them sitting on the floor in his office, and he'd phone the father and say, "This is what your son's done. Do I have permission to clap him?" And the father would always say yes, and lo and behold, they got caned. So it's an attitude that'll die hard.
Actually, I can match that. My brother, who took a backseat to nobody in violating rules and giving teachers grey hair, once came home very indignant that he had been caned for a reason he couldn't quite work out. And my mother, for once in her life, decided to take this up. Went to the principal. And he said, "Yes, Mrs. Corrigan, please come and sit down." And she said, "Well, she wants to understand why he was caned in this particular instance." And he said, "Well, your son is associated with the wrong elements." That was all my mother needed to hear to carry on.
No, there's a symbiosis between parents and headmasters.
No, very much so. All right, let us go on to our next item. And of course, we know that Julius Malema is famous for using his Twitter without much restraint. We had a show last week about how he was actually suspended for, I think it was 11 hours by Twitter for a series of tweets he had made, particularly one saying that if the army was sent out onto the streets, he would call on the EFF to join the looters and the protesters. He said, "No soldiers on our streets, otherwise we are joining. All fighters must be ready. They won't kill us all. We need a political solution to a political problem, not soldiers." He later went on to say, "Some of you are even calling for a state of emergency. Be careful of what you're asking for. As usual, they're going to kill the innocent in honor of Collins Causa, and all citizens who are harassed during level 5 say no to soldiers." I just want to say here that that's rather rich coming from him, because as far as I'm aware, in the parliamentary committees, the EFF was encouraging the government to scorp and dorner people with the police and army during lockdown to make sure that people obeyed. So he's done a typical Julius Malema move, which is to turn on a dime and suddenly be the opposite of what he was saying. But anyway, his original comments called saw the DA lay charges of incitement against him. They have now put that to the courts, and Julius Malema has reacted as one would expect. He's rather upset. He says that he's gotten his lawyers to send a letter to the DA demanding that Steenhuisen and the DA retract the allegations that Malema incited the violence. They also want the party to publicly apologize and withdraw the criminal charges laid against Julius Malema within 5 days, or else they will sue him. They said Malema did not incite anyone, including EFF members. Quote, in fact, our client has cautioned the law enforcement agencies to act lawfully when exercising their duties on the ground, to stop the looting from taking place and to act with restraint, to minimize the violence and to prevent further violence from taking place. The tweet you have referenced does not incite violence. And then they quote the Collins causal one. So, Sara, let me start with you. Do you think the DA's original thing has any merit? Like, do you think that there's an incitement case to be made here? And if so, what do you think? How do you think this is going to go in the courts?
I've never thought I would be on the side of Julius Malema, but this isn't the hill the DA should die on. It's first of all, it's actually not entirely clear what he is saying, because you could. I sort of initially read it as he's calling on the fighters to join people in opposing. I just don't think it's insightful enough, and I mean that both ways, both spellings, and I just don't think, it's Julius Malema at his most sort of weird and sort of, you're not quite sure whether he means one thing or another, saying one thing or another, and I think as a result he could probably not incite anyone to do anything.
It's much more ambiguous than when he said in response to the Clicks thing, fighters attack.
Yes,
which he somehow managed to escape any sort of legal consequences for.
As I say, I mean, this isn't the one I would have sort of read it, slept on it, and then read it again, because the Clicks one I think was unequivocal. This I think is equivocal, and I think it's not serious enough or important enough for the DA to go after it. I mean, and in any event, I mean, you talk about him saying the one thing and then saying the other thing. I mean, look, Julius has never pretended not to be a hypocrite, so. And this one's just like he started saying one thing and then he carried on saying another. It really wasn't so profound, or I don't think it sufficiently matches the requirement in terms of Section 16 of the Constitution with regard to the requirements for incitement. So I think even his own guys would have sort of smiled and said "raw," but then they would have said, "Well, what exactly did he mean? Should we go and find the guys with those Sjamboks?" I don't know.
Yeah, Terence, what do you make of this? Do you agree with what Sara was saying?
Yeah, I think they're going to find it very difficult to make those charges stick. On the other hand, Malema loves spectacle. This is his bread and butter. So I think that I think the word equivocal is good. I think what he was doing was saying something that could be interpreted variously. It's walking between the raindrops. It's reckless under the circumstances, I think. But that is unfortunately the nature of the political niche that he occupies. I suspect that he will probably walk away from this smiling, although I doubt very much that he would be able to make any kind of sort of defamation stand. But no, it's given the circumstances prevailing, given his track record and the track record of his party, particularly around the imbroglio with Clicks, I do think that tweet had the potential to be interpreted as a kind of call to arms.
Well, I wonder if the DA perhaps should have actually tried this when he said fighters attack against Clicks. That might have had a better chance of sticking. Though I remember, I think, didn't Clicks or someone take him to court and somehow he was found not to be guilty of incitement?
I don't recall. I mean, I think I probably would have, but I don't recall. I think the problem is also in the context. Short of saying go out and murder soldiers and join looters and kill policemen, there's so much going on in what's happened that for Julius to sort of say, well, get ready, troops, let's join the looters. The looters are not paying the blind bit of attention. I think if there's going to be any incitement at the moment politically, it's not going to come from the FF is not going to be paid much attention. It's going to be parts of the ruling party that somebody may or may not pay attention to.
I think when it comes to the violence and comes to looting and things like that, that's really beyond anyone's control, which does not mean that leaders get a free pass. It's just to say that the idea that there is some sort of malevolent force controlling things, or that this is a genie that can be stuffed back into the bottle. I don't think it's realistic. Which I think is also an important political question now, because there seems to be the spin that the government's trying to put on this. This was an insurrection. We identified these 12 elders of Zion, or whatever they want to call themselves, this is why this happened, not because we have a state that doesn't work and an economy that's tanked and we shut everyone down for a year. Right. Those are hard questions. The idea that there is a smoky room where people are rubbing their hands and making Da Vinci Code
and the Zuma children are organized, moving divisions around on a map.
Yeah,
difficult to imagine. It's also worth mentioning the DA didn't just lay incitement charges against Malema; they also laid incitement charges against 3 of Jacob Zuma's children, who expressed, I think, less ambiguous support for the looters on social media.
Didn't Duduzane, the heir apparent, call on people to loot responsibly? That's the word.
I didn't see that, but I'm not surprised.
Maintain social distancing and remember to wear your mask. And only 3 items per client.
I do think the best part, though, the lawyers, Malema's lawyers' response to the DA was that Steenhuisen's statements were deliberately meant to impinge on Malema's integrity and good name.
Wow.
Well, you can't create something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, so on that ground.
Well, that's telling them, is what I'm saying.
Right. So let us go to our last story for today, and this is a bit of a weird one. Some of you may be aware of the conservative American organization Turning Point USA. I think its founder, Charlie Kirk, is relatively well known amongst sort of people who follow politics around the world, particularly on the right. Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA were doing an event in Florida. I think it was yesterday or the day before. And they had an unusual VIP guest, a individual known publicly, at least, by the name Brandy Love. And what does she do? Well, she's a small businesswoman. She runs her own business, and she also happens to be a pornographic actress. And Brandy Love is, in fact, her stage name. She's famous for, among other things, being identified as politically conservative in the United States. She has expressed her support for the Second Amendment, lower taxation, God and guns, and all the sort of traditional red state values. And she was initially welcomed into the convention with quite a lot of enthusiasm. However, members of the sort of socially conservative right in the US found out about this. Some Twitter accounts connected to a neo-Nazi dude who's got quite a big social media following, or at least a enthusiastic social media following, spread out this news that this pornographic actress was in attendance. And immediately there was backlash. I think he's an editor on the New York Post, Sara, who's become one of the faces of America's social conservative intellectuals at the moment, said that this was outrageous and disgusting, and that there were people under the age of 15 there, and that they immediately needed to throw her out, which Turning Point USA did. which then provoked a response from other members of the right in the US, particularly the Federalists, to write in defense of her and saying that basically the party should be a big tent and shouldn't be throwing people out just for their profession. Terence, bit of a weird one. What do you think?
Well, a fun fact: her real name is Tracy Lynn Livermore, and yeah, I think that this highlights a number of very difficult and almost internally contradictory trends that have beset the modern world. 20 years ago, I think that inviting somebody in this industry into any kind of political environment would have been toxic. Pornography went from something that was underground, with state crackdowns. I'm talking about America and Europe in the 1960s, to something that was kind of tolerated, and cases like Denmark, where there were no laws on it, it was able to flourish. It became a big export industry, but often kind of tapes being smuggled out to other countries and whiskey containers and things like that. By the 1980s, it was becoming professional. You had the video revolution, so a lot of people could take it into their homes. Around the 90s, it started to become sort of glamorous. You had conventions, and you had award ceremonies. Now it's almost become mainstream. There's probably no hotel chain you can go to in the modern Western world where you cannot find pornographic channels. I read something the other day that it's at a point where in certain parts of America, in the more sort of liberal areas like California, there is such a sort of destigmatization of it that it's not seen as life or career limiting to be involved in this industry for a couple of years. The internet, of course, has made it enormously accessible. And I think that what you see here are those contradictions playing out in America's conservative movement. I think the same sort of thing is happening on the other side. As Miss Love or Miss Livermore, however she may choose to identify herself in this particular conversation, said, on the one hand, you have these delegates railing against cancel culture and censorship and wanting to be inclusive, but here I come, a person who I think she actually has American flags on her website, and I love my country, and I'm a small businesswoman who doesn't want tax. I mean, we've got a lot to say to each other. And you tell me because of my career choice or my personal standards of morality, you don't want me around. This is something I think that many of us around the world, are going to have to face. People do not come in prepackaged combinations. The idea of being, let's say, conservative socially, conservative economically, or whatever, as a package doesn't really exist. Conversely, you'll find that there is a great deal of almost Puritanism on the political left in America. That she'll probably be just as unwelcome in certain parts of parts of America's Democratic Party, because she is seen as objectifying women, or this is being completely un-PC and unwoke. Question for South Africa, yeah.
Sara, let me get your thoughts here quickly, because we don't have a lot of time on this. But I like what Terence said, that there seems to be this big discomfort currently in the US, where it's the sort of freewheeling liberty lifestyle doesn't really seem to have a home on either the political left or right. Traditionally, this was the ground of the left, but that's not so clear anymore. It seems much more confusing and murky these days.
Yeah, I think it is confusing, and I think what one has to remember is that the sort of the base of the American personality is a puritanical one, and it comes out in different times in different guises. But just to finish off, perhaps I could just say that the mind boggles at the idea of Brandy Love meeting young men with Sjamboks.
Now you see, that's the content that people will pay for. Right, and on that
Actually,
note,
I think it would really depend on who's holding the Sjambok in that scenario.
yeah, definitely. All right, before we get ourselves demonetized and taken off from YouTube, not that we run ads on YouTube, I don't think, but anyway, thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you have a wonderful day, and we will see you tomorrow for more news and analysis on the Daily Friend Show. Please check out thedailyfriend.co.za for news and opinion, and check out the IRR's website, irr.org.za. Anyway, thank you very much, and we will see you tomorrow.